I'm Aimee Ng, curator at the Frick Collection in New York, and welcome to my very last episode of Cocktails with a Curator. Don't worry, this isn't the very end. Julio and Xavier still have their goodbye episodes to air in the next couple of weeks. It has been, of course, an enormous pleasure and privilege to reach you around the world in your homes during this very difficult time. So thank you so much for having tuned in for so many months. And don't worry, we'll have other programming and you can come and visit us in person as well. This episode brings us again to the fourth floor of Frick Madison and to the grand British portraiture gallery looking toward room 20 with the Constable and Turners. And the focus of this episode is the portrait on the left, which is a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds of Selina, Lady Skipwith. And the cocktail that I've chosen today, it's definitely the most ridiculous one that I have presented to you, pays some tribute to this woman as a person, as an experiencing human being. Over the course of my research about this portrait and its sitter, I've had the opportunity to study her journals and correspondence with enormous thanks to her relatives, the Shirley family. And in them, one learns some interesting things about her and about life of a privileged British woman around this time. And the cocktail actually takes from an entry written by her November 30th, 1828, in which she writes that she has tasted asparagus for the very first time. So yes, this is an asparagus-based cocktail. A vegetable that was not necessarily indigenous to England, but that eventually made its way there. There are surprisingly a number of cocktails recipes for asparagus out there. And admittedly, I really scaled this one down. This is an Asparagus Fizz. And honestly, it was because my liquor cabinet has swelled so much over the last 14 months because of the Cocktails with the Curator program, that I just don't have any more room for an obscure, exotic liquor. So this really is just a muddled asparagus, gin, lemon juice, and some champagne, garnished with spears. Cheers to you. That's dangerous. I'm glad I'm wearing glasses today. Sir Joshua Reynolds, in the context of 18th century British painting, is often described as the great rival to Thomas Gainsborough in terms of vying for the most successful, the most popular portraitist of their age. But there's no denying that Joshua Reynolds, shown here in an early portrait by him in the National Portrait Gallery, was just more successful professionally. By which I mean he held these powerful positions of authority as the founding president of the Royal Academy of Arts in London from 1768 all the way until his death in 1792, and in that position really influencing and shaping generations of artists who attended the Royal Academy and its schools. He was also painter and ordinary to the King, George III. So he really was prominent, he really was influential in ways that Gainsborough just did not reach. Reynolds too could command, to some degree, higher prices for his portraits, higher than anybody around. This is a later portrait, about 40 years after that earlier portrait by Reynolds, now in the Royal Collections. And it's painted around the time that he is painting our portrait of Selina, Lady Skipwith. He's in his 60s. He's painting her in 1787. And the painting has all of the hallmarks of what might be described as Reynolds' late style, by which it actually approaches more the style of Gainsborough, the sort of looser brushstrokes, a little bit more atmospheric, layering of paints with very visible marks. This is just a detail of that atmospheric background against which Selina is presented. And this is a detail of the little nosegay that's tucked into her neck kerchief, which is a little bouquet of flowers that would be a common accessory of women that would obviously promote pleasing fragrances both to her and for the other people around her. And this is not the place to get into hygiene and smells in 18th century Britain, of course. This sort of array of whites and lights, his play with the fairness, the paleness of her skin pitted against that white glove that has been removed, held in her hand, and the variations and strokes in that almost loosely defined skirt of her dress. And almost one of the more shocking passages of looseness and almost a sense of unfinished. This is her left hand draped almost limply over the armrest of the wood bench on which she is sitting. And that bench is just sort of, loosely suggested by color and by stroke. And the curled fingers of her hand, even just dots of white paint and squiggles. But of course, there was a lot of care to the articulation of her face and her features. And of course, this, to some degree, is the heart of a portrait is the likeness of the face. Of course, there is more care there. And this is a place to note that the fashion for women in Britain, in elite society at the time, even if you're a young woman, and she's 35 years old in this picture, was to have their hair either big or a large wig that was powdered white or as gray, light gray as could be. And this was a signal of feminine beauty, despite the fact that now, today, we might associate these colors with age and being an older person. This was sort of the hallmark of feminine beauty for her social class at the time. And of course, the whiteness of her skin, we've talked about this a number of times before, ideal of feminine beauty in her culture that was tied to class and race, and which was exaggerated by the application of makeup, often containing the very deadly lead white. And many stories and anecdotes of women putting on this white makeup to really accentuate the whiteness of their faces, suffering from lead poisoning, rotting teeth, falling out. In fact, a number of women died from lead poisoning through the application of makeup. And that bright, almost feverish red blotch on her cheek, this is, again, an almost exaggeration of blush. Again, one of these qualities of ideal feminine beauty, both about youth and health, but also about modesty, about the kind of woman who could blush. Maybe if you said something untoward, a young woman who could blush, as opposed to one who could not, or who had seen it all and would not. A number of people visiting the galleries have asked me or have said to each other, "Why does she look so sad?" And it's exacerbated, I think, a little bit by the excruciating paleness and that feverish red blotch. She looks almost sickly, like as if she's soon going to die of consumption. And it's a little bit of a problem of what art historians might refer to as period eye. How can we, in the year 2021, from all diversities of perspectives, understand what kind of expression she is meant to be making for her peers and her first audiences in this portrait? Given the primary functions of portraiture in this culture, especially of women promoting feminine beauty, promoting lineage, qualities that would make ideal women in these families, this is probably meant to be a very positive depiction of her, something demure, humble, modest, that sort of almost sensitive, but also steady and complacent at the same time. So that sort of complex expression that's looking out into the distance, probably meant to be a very positive one and sort of exuding these sort of ideal qualities of women of her class. But what we do know about her from her letters and from her diary is that she was actually very sad. She was not very happily married just about a year and a half by the time she sat to Joshua Reynolds in May of 1787. She ended up marrying a man who was her father's friend. So he was an older man whom she had rejected a number of times before. She had wanted to marry somebody else and her father would not let her. And there came a point just a few years before her portrait was painted by Reynolds, before she was married, where she was the last unmarried eldest sister in her household. And she writes a letter to her brother, really talking about her heartbreak and you know, her missed opportunity to marry the person that she loved, and sort of that position of her now left at home in this position, of course, in this culture, being over the age of 30 as a woman and unmarried in your home would have been devastating. And so Thomas Skipwith, who is depicted on the right in a portrait a little bit earlier than Reynolds' portrait of Selina, by the American artist who was working in London, Gilbert Stuart. He, I guess, proposes again, despite having been rejected a number of times. And she finally accepts. They are engaged in July of 1785 and married just a few months later in September. The strange thing about this place of her engagement and marriage in her biography, in her life, is that she's kept a journal since she's about 15 years old. And it's pretty cursory. It's, you know, the recording the comings and goings of her family, business, the races that they go to, their travel between the 3 or 4 residences around England. But on the day that we know from other sources that she became engaged in July of 1785, she doesn't write about it. She doesn't mention it. The only thing she writes for that day is Miss S, which is short form for herself, Miss Shirley, which was her unmarried surname. She's referring to herself in the third person. Miss S went for a ride in Bushy Park. And that's it. She doesn't mention that she's engaged. She doesn't mention a marriage that is coming up or any preparations for it. In fact, kind of curiously, just before she gets married, she either stops writing entirely in her journal with a hiatus of some 15 years, or this section of her journal just before she's getting married to this man was lost or dispersed, even just a couple of decades after her death. What is there instead, in this sort of gap of 15 years of entries, because she does pick up again later, are transcriptions of poems and other kinds of writings by other artists, namely things like, one of them is a poem by Francis Greville called A Prayer for Indifference, which is sort of a call for, like, a hope to stop feeling ups and downs. And it's easy to sort of project what we know of her biography on reading these excerpts that are transcribed in her writing in these pages, that she's just trying not to care, you know. And it's a little bit heartbreaking reading it, but she's not writing anything explicitly in her journal about the ups and downs. You know, it is actually sad, because 3 years after Reynolds paints her in this sort of flamboyant blue hat and wide white skirt on this wooden bench, she's widowed. Thomas Skipwith dies. And peculiarly, it's only after his death, in just the month after he dies, that she as a widow is listed in Reynolds' account book, paying for this portrait. So there's a question of when did the portrait end up with them? Did they live with it as a married couple? Did it remain with Reynolds? And she, you know, the death of her husband prompted this, you know, unpaid bill, and maybe only then did it come home with her. So the early history of this portrait, who actually commissioned it, is unknown, although there's a listing for her specifically paying for this portrait very soon after her husband's death. So when he dies at 1790, she's only been married 4.5 years with no children at the age of 38. And by her relations accounts, he was not a worthy husband. He was referred to as an unworthy husband who may have, you know, been gallivanting as a younger person. But the one thing he is praised for doing is to show respect for his wife, is that he actually leaves to her his family estate, which is not always the case. Sometimes that passes to a male relative in his line. But he leaves to her, Selina Shirley, Lady Skipwith, the Skipwith estate that belongs to him until the end of her life, at which point it would pass to somebody else. And that somebody else, because they had no children, even, you know, before his death, he had selected an heir. He had a distant American branch of the Skipwith family who ran the plantation in Prestwood, Virginia, which still today is the site of some of the earliest slave dwellings in the United States. A distant branch of the Skipwith family had some sons, and he selected a young boy to be sent to England to be raised as his son in his sort of branch of the family. He's a young man called Gray Skipwith, is sent to Eton, and becomes, by all means, sort of the perfect English boy, and would inherit after Lady Skipwith's death her husband's estate. Many stories of 18th century British women would end right here. She lived as a widow, and how very sad. We can only imagine the rest of her life, except for Lady Skipwith. There's actually the second act to her life. And amazingly, some 40 years after Reynolds paints her in this picture, she's depicted by another leading artist of British painting of the time, and that is Sir Thomas Lawrence, who, when she is 76 years old, and he is, in the prime of his career, sort of famous around Europe, he paints her. And he's the successor to Reynolds in many respects, including becoming president of the Royal Academy, including becoming patron ordinary to the king. And he's painting Lady Skipwith really around the same time, just in the same couple of years that he paints our beloved portrait of Lady Peel at the Frick. So it's really 1827 he paints this, and he's painting Lady Skipwith just the year after in 1828. And it's really extraordinary for those who are interested in sort of the history of British portraiture to think of a septuagenarian woman being the subject and to some degree the patron of a portrait by her. We understand from her diaries as well as external sources, she was friends with Lawrence's sister, Mrs. Anne Bloxham, and the artist Lawrence, as a sort of thank you gesture for the kindness that Lady Skipwith had shown to his sister, painted this portrait of her. However, Lady Skipwith did not want to be given a gift of this. She wanted to sort of pay for it and be the patron of it. So she actually paid her friend, Mrs. Bloxham, the £350 that she would have paid to the artist. So it was not a gift to her. She did, in a sense, patronize the artist for this portrait. Again, an interesting moment in the history of arts patronage by somebody of her age and as a widow. Her journal also, in this sort of second act of her life after the year 1800, tells of sort of a whole different kind of person. And first of all, she's writing differently too. So her journal starts again in the year 1800, 15 years after her marriage. It cuts off again, and then it restarts toward the end of her life. And she writes differently. She writes more floridly. She includes many more details about the asparagus, for example, about going for rides, about how social she is. And she actually starts writing in the first person, as opposed to referring to herself in the third person. She talks about I and what she feels and what she does. And kind of amazingly, for a woman who was childless, was widowed at an early age, she becomes a mother, in a sense, by adopting her first child when she is already 52. She adopts actually one of the 20 children of Gray Skipwith as her own daughter, Gray Skipwith being the American-born heir to the Skipwith estate in England. She adopts the second child after that first child is married off in her 70s. So, as an older woman, she really takes on this sort of nurturing, caretaking aspect that was not part of her biography before that. What we know about her from writings about her from her family is that she was sort of strict and formidable, but also this kind of amazingly vivacious older woman. And her, one description talks about her riding her horse all the time, well into her 70s, and being able to dismount from the horse without any assistance, just like a young girl would. So she's sitting here in this portrait, actually looking out with that kind of forthrightness, that sort of small smile and a pertness of expression that gives you a sense of the strength and confidence that is, to some degree, wholly missing from the earlier portrait by Reynolds. It's a little bit strange what happens to these two pictures, because in the legacy of her and her belongings, she actually separates them. The earlier portrait by Reynolds, she leaves with her married Skipwith family. But the older, happier portrait of her, she actually sends to her Shirley family relations, of her own family in which she was born. Whether or not that reflects a difference in the way she felt about the two portraits is unknown, but their sort of resultant fates have also been somewhat telling. The Reynolds earlier portrait remained with the Skipwith family for some decades, but was sold toward the end of the 19th century, and Henry Clay Frick acquired it through Knoedler. The Lawrence portrait, the older, happier picture, still remains, is still with the Shirley family today, her family today. And the portrait of Lady Skipwith by Reynolds was beloved in this sort of Frick's collection history of these, British portraits of ladies. And here's a 1927 photograph of his library, where it remained installed for many, many decades, and is paired with another portrait by Reynolds on the other side of that room. I hope you can see on the back wall of this. And you'll see the same kind of pairing again at Frick Madison. What's struck me as I learned more about this portrait, every time I see it at Frick Madison now, it just amazes me that, again, the place of portraiture in somebody's life, there's no hint in this earlier portrait by Reynolds of the life to come, of the horses she would ride, the children she would raise, the portrait by Lawrence that would present such a different identity for her, a different being. And of course, no hint of the asparagus that she would finally taste at age 76. And with that last return to what admittedly is not a delicious cocktail at all, I reiterate my enormous thanks to all of you for all of your attention and support and interest, comments and emails and postings. We will see you again in our other programming, but even better yet, hope to see you at Frick Madison over the next couple of years, and then of course back at the Frick House. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again.